Great pleasure to welcome you here today. My name is Bob Orr. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Policy here at the University of Maryland. Normally, launching a handbook would not be news, and it wouldn't attract people from around the country. Handbooks may not sound sexy, but when you put the words cybersecurity or cyber elections and security all in the same sentence, it turns to what I would describe as the policy equivalent of a Category 5 storm. It is a great pleasure to welcome a number of partners and collaborators in the enterprise of trying to ensure the nation's cybersecurity infrastructure with respect to elections. It's in particular a pleasure to welcome John Gilligan, the CEO of the Center for Internet Security, with whom we have a partnership in this space. This handbook that the center took the lead on and networked really all the top organizations in the country to come up with this handbook is not only an exemplary outcome, but really an exemplary process. And I want to thank John and all his colleagues for the leadership they've shown on this. This gets to the heart of the matter, the issue of governance of cybersecurity infrastructure with respect to elections. There are many technical challenges, there are many technical issues, but what we face as a country is a real governance challenge on this. And the process that has been followed to bring all these actors together is significant, it is novel, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it in the future. The guests you will hear from in a minute are really the leading players in the field around the country, and I think it's significant that they've come here together today to do this. I want to recognize and turn the microphone over to Dr. David Mussington, who is a professor here at the School of Public Policy and the head of our Center for Public Policy and Private Enterprise. David is not only a cybersecurity expert, but he runs a center that operates across the boundaries of the private sector and the public sector. And on these issues, we are not going to solve the challenges and seize the opportunities in this space unless we seamlessly move across those boundaries, as well as that with the nonprofit sector as well. So it is a vibrant space. There are many, many challenges before us, but with the kind of people we have in this room here today, and with the handbook that's being launched here today, I think we are taking a big step forward, and I thank you for coming and welcome you all today. Dr. Mussington, the floor is yours. And I'm sorry, before I turn it over to you, I forgot to recognize Linda Lamone, our own Maryland administrator for our state electoral commission. Linda, your leadership in our state has been exemplary, and I want to thank you very much.
I'll stay in front of the panel for more than a few seconds. I just wanted to first of all share with the Dean our thanks to Linda Lamone, who's allowed the Center for Public Policy and Private Enterprise to do some research under some fairly unique conditions to allow us to understand how Maryland executes its really novel approach to cybersecurity in election administration, and to draw some lessons by opening some avenues of communication between ourselves and other states in search of some common practices and common approaches, both current and forward-looking. So thank you, Secretary Lamone. More generally, I'd like to sort of emphasize the value of the partnership with the Center for Internet Security in this issue and in other issues as we broaden the center and the school's curriculum and research in cybersecurity. We plan on making this the platform for future efforts. I was at a conference over the last few days at MIT where representatives of over 40 countries expressed their views on cyber risk management in this sector. So it's not just a US concern. There are best practice sharing processes across national boundaries from which we can probably learn. One element of which is the sharing of best practices, which this publication best exemplifies. So, over to you, John.
I'd like to thank Dean Orr and Dr. Mussington for inviting us to hold our rollout of the handbook here, and also all of the state and local vendors, the associations who have participated in the development of this document. I've got a couple of quick messages. One is just a minute of background on the Center for Internet Security. We're a nonprofit organization headquartered outside Albany, New York. Our focus is on best practice primarily, and trying to help cultivate and disseminate best practices that can improve global cybersecurity. We also, since 2005, operate what is called the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which provides security training, education, communications, threat monitoring, et cetera, for state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations. It was in the context of those two focuses of the best practices and what we're already doing in the state and local governments that served as the catalyst for us looking at the need and the potential benefit of having a technically oriented handbook that could be used by elections organizations to guide their efforts in trying to determine how secure they are and where they could go in terms of additional security improvements. Second message is cybersecurity is not a new topic. It's been around for a long time. We had a previous session and sort of half jest, I said, you know, I've been working this since 1974, which is literally the case. There are a lot of things that have not changed. What has changed is the frequency of occurrence of attacks, and the significance of the attacks has continued to increase. And so I'll just give you a quick windshield tour reminder. If you think back to one of the, in the last 10 years, one of the largest breaches was back at Heartland Payment Systems, credit card processing capability. 134 million credit cards were breached. TJX, again, another, Marshalls, TJ Maxx, $94 million credit cards. Target, 110 million credit cards. RSA Security, here's a security company that was successfully hacked, and a lot of their intellectual property was lost. Adobe in 2013. eBay 2014, Home Depot in 2014, Anthem, the healthcare provider in 2015, Uber 2016, Deloitte 2017. So, and each of these has had, it's just the big ones, and it's a daily occurrence. And so this is not a new activity, nor is state-sponsored participation in cyber attacks. That is not new either. So back in 1974, when I was working on research efforts, it was to try to protect against one bit of information passing between systems that was not supposed to pass. And in our minds, the bit was launch the nukes. I mean, that was sort of the mindset we had in the middle of the Cold War. In today's environment, and more recently, we have examples like Estonia. Many people designate Estonia, the actions in Estonia was really the first cyber war. Subsequent to that, we have Stuxnet. In this case, the shoe's on the other foot, perhaps, in terms of Stuxnet. Was an extraordinarily successful attack, and clearly done by nation states. Sony Pictures in 2011. Office of Personnel Management, an attack that was persistent for 2 years, where 22 million, personally identifiable information sources were distributed. And the most recent being Equifax, where 140 million accounts, so these are individuals who have credit, so it's about half of the US population, the data was compromised. So your social security number, driver's license number, your credit history, et cetera. Clearly, these are very significant attacks. So elections are different. That's true. They're the bedrock of our democracy, and hence there's a lot of anxiety around the potential attacks against our bedrock of democracy, but it is a fact of life and it will continue. I think the nice thing about the panel today and what we were trying to do is we're trying to not only recognize that there is an awful lot of energy being expended to provide security for our election systems, but that effort and energy has increased dramatically over the recent times in response to what is recognized as a continuing and likely escalating threat. Today's panel will have short presentations. We're going to limit to about 5 minutes each of opening comments, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So if you've got questions, please begin to prepare them. We're going to start the panel with Dr. Mike Garcia. Mike has been working with the Center for Internet Security. He is the primary author of the handbook, and he'll provide a little bit of context in terms of what the handbook is, what we're doing with it, why we did it, and what we hope to be the benefit. Then we're going to turn to Secretary Connie Lawson. Secretary Lawson is the Secretary of State for Indiana. She is also the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. She will be followed by Ms. Amy Cohen, who is the executive director of the National Association of State Elections Directors, who will be followed by Matt Masterson, who is a commissioner with the Elections Assistance Commission. And finally, last but not least for sure, is Mr. Tom Conley. Tom is the Director of Elections Operation for the New York Board of Elections, and Tom was one of the key contributors to the handbook. So with that, as I understand, this podium is going to disappear, and we'll let the panel start. So Secretary Lawson, or excuse me, Mike, do you want to start?
My time ran out already.
Yeah.
I will be brief because while I did type most of the words in the handbook, they were really just typing the smart ideas of these folks and the members of the organizations they represent. So in cybersecurity and elections, we've seen an awful lot of activity over the last year plus. And so when CIS was trying to decide what their level of involvement should be in the space, we said, we don't want to be a contributor to a potential problem that we've seen in cybersecurity before that is known as the fog of war. And all of a sudden, all of these election officials go from very little guidance on what to do about cybersecurity to way too much guidance and not knowing which one's the best guidance, which one's the right guidance, what to pick, conflicting guidance. So we want to make sure we created something that wasn't exacerbating that as a problem. So took a look at the space and said, what aren't we seeing? And the first thing, most important, where CIS is a good fit, is that we haven't seen well-grounded technical systematic guidance on what to do about election cybersecurity. So there was a lot of, here are a bunch of problems that we see in elections with regards to cybersecurity. Here are a bunch of things everybody should be doing, but not a really systematic effort to provide details technically on what should be done. So that was one role we thought we should fill. The second one, which is really common in a lot of different industries, was about communication, was about the ability of technical people to explain to non-technical people what's going on, why it matters, and what the potential consequences are. And so we thought we may be able to solve that problem, or at least provide a stepping stone towards solving that. So those two things really provided the motivation for the handbook. Can we provide practical technical guidance on how to reduce risk management perspective, and can we close that communications gap? So in this effort, which was a collaborative effort between a number of associations, federal government, state governments, local governments, nonprofits that are working in this space, vendors that are working in this space, all trying to create something that can be used practically by anyone that's working in this space, we decided to generate this handbook, which does three basic things, very simply. Provides an introduction to the space. Why does it matter? Why does elections risk matter? Why does cybersecurity matter? And how do you manage risk in cybersecurity as it applies to elections? The second one is, what do election systems actually look like? What are the risks? What are the threats that are associated with them? And then how can we classify them from a cybersecurity perspective in a way that's relatively simple so that someone who's non-technical can understand what needs to be done, and yet is smart enough that someone technical and deep enough that someone technical can take a look at that and say, okay, now I know what specific actions I need to take. And that last part's really critical because it connects the non-technical portion of the document with the technical portion of the document. So that classification then is what lays out the third part of the document, which is 88 best practices that we didn't just make up. They're either well-known practices in elections, or they're well-known practices in cybersecurity that have been applied in other industries before and have been demonstrated to reduce risk. So we didn't want to create something new. And the reality here is that for most of these things, they're IT componentry. And while we may be using them in a specialized way for elections, they're IT componentry. And so if we're managing IT in other sectors, whether this is a special use or not, it's still managing risk. And so a lot of the same types of controls and best practices apply. So we really didn't want to create anything new that we didn't have to. We wanted to tailor it and explain it in a way that made sense for elections folks. So out of all of that, here's what we found to be the really good news. 88 actually sounds like a fairly large number of things to do. Some of them are relatively easy things to do. Some of them are certainly more complicated. But we do believe that most of the elections jurisdictions, elections officials that are in charge of those jurisdictions are already accomplishing most of these things. The majority of them will already be done. In some cases, the vast majority will already be done. But within each of these best practices, we have prioritization, high, medium prioritization. We have a notion of what it costs up front to implement them, what it costs on an ongoing basis to implement them. So if you have some X number of dollars left in the pot for this year, and you want to apply them towards cybersecurity, you can take a look at these best practices. These are the ones we're already doing. These are the ones that aren't applicable. Here are the high priority ones that are left that we're not doing. Do we have low ongoing funds, but some funds right now that we can spend? Okay, great. I can pick out the ones that make sense for me. So you have a better opportunity to more clearly prioritize your work based on what your actual resources are. So another interesting point about this is, for us, and really important point, is that a lot of these things are just good IT management practices as well. And so even if it says perhaps that it's like a low ongoing cost, the reality is when you get something like this in place, you're better managing your IT organization. And so you can actually reduce costs. So the idea that, well, we are resource strapped in this environment, or any given election jurisdiction is resource strapped, it's certainly the case. But it may be the case that they were able to save money and free up resources to take other actions by executing better IT management practices. And we hope that this handbook can help them do that. But one of the things that's really important to us about this is that it's an ongoing process. We really emphasize cybersecurity isn't something that you do and then walk away from because check, we're done with it. It's an evolutionary process. And so for CIS, it's also not a one-time thing to produce this static handbook and walk away from it. And so we're taking on a couple additional activities that we think will help assist in implementation of the handbook and will further the gains that can be made from it. So first, we're creating an assessment tool so that local jurisdictions can take this assessment tool and say, and walk through it in a simplified way and say, what are we already doing in these best practices? Which ones aren't we doing, and how can we prioritize them? So rather than taking it out of a hard copy or even a digital copy, something that's a tool that really walks them through it, allows them to sort it, select things as they need to, whatever makes most sense for those folks to do. Also, so that someone who's on the IT side of things and more technical side of things can conduct this assessment and take a report and hand it back to someone who's non-technical and say, these are the things I need to do and these are the things I need to be resourced for. Second, that self-assessment is really a precursor to doing independent evaluations. We really want to see that happening. But we know that that's not the sort that costs money, often for one, and it takes time. And there are somewhere in the whereabouts of 8,800 election jurisdictions, so we can't go do all of them tomorrow. So start at the self-assessment, and then as the resources are there and the bandwidth is there for those that are conducting these assessments, go out and do independent ones. And so we're creating a training program for assessors, independent assessors. So that could be an independent firm that could be hired. It could be someone like the National Guard that governors might choose that they want to leverage for conducting assessments. It could be someone within, say, a state's IT organization that gets tasked with conducting assessments. We don't care who it is from CIS's perspective. We just want to make sure they're properly trained to conduct the assessments and get it right. The third activity that we're taking on is that one of the things we learned through this is that many smaller, especially smaller elections jurisdictions, they are heavily reliant on contracted IT resources. Sometimes to the point where multiple counties are being served by the same contractor who comes in once every other week. And that's all of the IT support for the entire county, not just the election side of it. And so we want to create a procurement guide that makes it easier for elections officials to procure the proper services. And so essentially, the simplest way to think about it is taking this handbook and these best practices and turning it into contract clauses that an election official could, at their choosing, include in their contracts. Hopefully getting better results, hopefully adding something to the standardization of IT support in this field. So between those few things, we think that we can really accomplish something. As we've been talking to stakeholders, both elections officials and vendors, they've actually said themselves, well, we think this could really help on the hardware side, the software side, and in the IT support side. So, in general, CIS really believes in a collaborative approach, and for all of these additional things that we'll be doing, it's essential to have these folks with us and conducting this work with us. We may have some technical expertise, but we're not down on the ground executing and administering elections. And so these are the folks who really matters to you. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Michael Garcia and John Gilligan for the handbook. It provides a great tool for states to use to determine how well we're doing. As you all know, every state is different. Every state has different local jurisdictions that they're working with. Every state works with different vendors. I would say that if you haven't read the introductory part of this handbook, that's as important as the 88 tools, because it really does describe to you many of the different systems that are used for elections. So it's a good read for you. As I mentioned, every state is different, and so and security has always been a priority, election security in every state. And there are a number of protocols that we followed for many, many years. However, as an election administrator, I would say that my life changed in September of 2016 when the FBI sent out a notice that we needed to search for 2 IP addresses that may or may not have tried at least to intrude into our statewide voter registration systems. And Indiana is a medium state, but from January of 2016 until that day in September, we checked every login into our statewide voter registration system, and there were 15,500,000. And that just shows you how busy states are running elections. And so the county clerks were dealing with candidates who were declaring their candidacy. They were checking signatures on petitions. They were dealing with absentee ballots, all those things. So 15,500,000, and that wasn't even up to Election Day. So my life changed, and we have spent numerous hours, days, weeks on cybersecurity for elections ever since. So I thought you would be interested in knowing some of the things that Indiana has done. As I mentioned, every state is different. Not every state has steps we've been able to take, but when I was before the General Assembly in 2017 during our budget cycle, I was asking for the dollars to modernize our statewide voter registration system, and when I told them there were 15,500,000 logins, that was a good key for them to hear. So we have done a lot of work. The first thing we did was we migrated our data from one private vendor to another private vendor where we felt we could get more individualized attention and that the security was better. So that was the first thing we did, and that was about a 9-month process to get all that data converted. We have 4,800,000 registered voters in the state of Indiana. The next thing we did was we worked very diligently with our partners, with the Election Assistance Commission, Department of Homeland Security, Center for Internet Security, and others, where we actually, Indiana became a state that is a pilot state where we have an internet monitor on our statewide voter registration system so that the MSISEC, the Multi-State Information Sharing Analysis Center, can help us analyze any traffic that we have into that system. And so that's been installed. Indiana is a pilot state. I, as a secretary, have applied for my security clearance, and that is moving along. I have my interim security clearance, and I've been able to sit in a couple of classified briefings to find out exactly what I needed to know. And soon I will be able to have a couple of staff members who I can share that information with, because it won't do me any good to have the information if I can't share with the people on my staff who can help me react to that information. The other things that we've been doing is we've moved all of our outward-facing websites, like indianavoters.com and others, and our electronic poll books. They are no longer working off of the actual database. They are working off of a mirror of the database. And so I think that that's an important step to take. We're also implementing, we have a pilot running in 10 counties right now where the counties will be required to use a multi-factor access into the system. So their computer addresses, you know, the very first thing that they've asked us to do is whitelist IP addresses that can access the device. Well, we've always done that in statewide voter registration system, but we're piloting a token program where they will have to insert the token and be physically present in front of the computer in order to access it, put in the additional password, but the additional security we put in place is that token will also have a time device. So if I'm a part-time employee and I'm only supposed to be at work from 8 to noon, that's when that token allows me to access the system. And so we've also done with the counties a phishing email program. We've got education to do, we know that, but I will tell you that the counties were very eager to learn how they had done and to learn more about how they can recognize those phishing emails. So we're off to a good start there. In Indiana, our governor has set up a cybersecurity council, and there is an election sector of which I chair. So we have county IT people as part of that. We have county clerks. We have our election division directors who are a member of the NASED group that Amy will be speaking about soon. And so we have a number of election officials who sit on that Cybersecurity Commission, and we are certainly making progress in the state of Indiana, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. But again, I would just say I really appreciate the partnership. I think that the states are learning a lot from DHS, EAC, and as a member of the Government Coordinating Council that Department of Homeland Security has set up, it's really been, it's been a learning experience, but we've also been able to teach DHS and others how elections are actually run, and it's been a benefit, I think, to the security of our elections.
Sorry, it's disrupting the flow, but I have to interrupt here. You just listened to a Secretary of State talk about application whitelisting, multi-factor authentication, and time-based tokens. Anyone who says that Secretaries of State are not paying attention to cybersecurity, they're out of their minds. Just really.
Does this one work? Okay. I am here representing election directors in all 50 states, DC, and the 4 territories. And for those of you who don't know, election directors oversee and implement the policy and procedures and technology that make elections happen. And importantly, they work very closely with the 8,000 to 10,000 local election jurisdictions across the country to make sure that these policies and procedures and technologies make their way down to the local level. And Secretary Lawson mentioned that her life changed with this new focus on cybersecurity, and I think that's true across the board that my members in all 50 states would acknowledge that. But security has also always been part of the election official job description, and it has always been something that they have been very focused on. Contingency planning is a huge part of what an election director does to prepare for the worst case scenario, be that a hurricane or a cyber incident. But what the critical infrastructure designation has allowed election officials to do is take advantage of more resources and more expertise, like the Center for Internet Security, but also free resources from DHS and from others to make sure that we are prepared in the event of an incident. And all 50 states, the territories, and DC are working at the state and the local level to improve security and to learn from experts, which is why things like the handbook are so critical, because they are written, as Mike mentioned, both for the technical person, but also to help that technical person explain that to the non-technical person, because everybody needs to really have an understanding of what's going on. And NASED members were very involved in the writing of the handbook and provided a lot of expertise and examples, which you can see where there are really state-specific examples of security practices in the handbook, and including the ones that Secretary Lawson mentioned, and I know that Tom will talk about in a few minutes. NASED members also participate in many of the efforts that all of the efforts that are happening at the national level around cybersecurity. So there's the Government Coordinating Council and the MS-ISAC, and as Secretary Lawson, she mentioned that Indiana was part of the pilot. We had, I think, 7 states total who were participating in the pilot project with the MS-ISAC and the Albert sensors. But NASED members are also have long-term involvement in other efforts, including the Technical Guidelines Development Committee with the Election Assistance Commission and NIST to develop standards for the voluntary voting system guidelines. Those are the standards that our voting technology is certified to for the years to come. And so it's important. This is something that my members really value their participation in, and is something that they will continue to be involved in. Also, the efforts led by the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School to put together also a playbook and help election officials understand how to respond to incidents, and importantly, how to take those learnings and translate them for their local election officials, who, as Mike mentioned, are very reliant on contractors and outside expertise. And we'll continue to work with the EAC on these kinds of best practices and information sharing, because there really is information overload right now, and handbooks like the one that CIS has put out are really important in making sure that election officials aren't overwhelmed and do feel like they have concrete next steps that they can do. And one of the nice things that I do really like about the handbook is that they are already doing a lot of these things. And so it is good to be able to say, we have room for improvement, but we are actually taking these concrete steps to make progress. I know Tom will talk more about what they're doing in the state of New York, and let me also thank CIS for having NASED on this panel and for including us in this conversation.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you to CIS and to John and to Mike and the University of Maryland for hosting this important conversation. My name is Matt Masterson. I'm a commissioner with the United States Election Assistance Commission. I want to thank all of you for being here. I assumed there was actually a big screen TV behind me with the games on, but it turns out you're here, and we'll try to make it quick so you can check the scores. For those not familiar with the Election Assistance Commission, we're an independent, bipartisan federal agency that is dedicated to serving election officials. So our job is to work directly with folks like Secretary Lawson and Tom and Linda Lamone to provide services, to provide information, to provide best practices to state and local election officials to help improve the process. And that's everything from cybersecurity to poll worker recruitment and training to serving voters with language needs or voters with disabilities. And so we have a broad view of the elections process and how to help. We also have a voluntary testing and certification program for the testing and certification of voting systems. And so we work with the National Institute of Standards and Technology to write guidelines that those systems are tested to, in which 47 out of 50 states use some part of our process. So that means they use either the standards that we create, the full certification. So my home state of Ohio, where I was a state-level election official in CIO, we required the sticker on the voting systems from the EAC, and other states will use portions of the standards or the testing labs that we accredit with NIST to evaluate just the voting systems. And it's important as we look at the handbook and the approach on this to understand that that's just the voting system element of it, but there are so many other IT systems that impact elections. There are voter registration databases and e-poll books, electronic poll books, and ballot on demand printers, and even just the localized IT systems that your local election office needs to run an office, like email. And so securing those, ensuring proper best practices and cyber hygiene around those has been a focus for the EAC since our creation, but certainly that's been heightened since 2016. As you've heard the panelists already say, elections are in a new operating environment. We're operating in an environment in which sophisticated, advanced actors, nation-state actors in some cases, are targeting election systems. And so for the elections community, when 2016 presented itself, they rose to the challenge and met that new operating environment by engaging any and all stakeholders they could to understand the scope and nature of the threat, and then the tangible steps they could be taking to both get the information they need to secure the systems and actually take the steps to secure the process itself. And I honestly believe that we've reached a really critical moment for democracy and elections in that there's a real opportunity. This is the most focus I've seen in my, just now, over a decade, I'm getting old, of experience in elections. It used to be, I've always worked in election technology at either the state or federal level. We couldn't get anybody to talk about this. This was not a topic of interest. Any state election official, any local election official would tell you they can't get anyone to show up to watch the testing of the systems or to talk about the security of the process. But here we are in a room with the NCAA tournament going on, and you all chose to be here to talk about the security of the election systems. This is important, and so we have a real opportunity. And I think as we look at securing elections, as has been said, security's always been part of the conversation, but the resources and the attention and the work of a group like the Center for Internet Security has not always been available to election officials. And so what I have seen over the last year and a half as the EAC has worked with election officials is an opportunity to engage a variety of expert stakeholders to educate them on how the election process works by putting them in the room with the people who actually run elections, and then talking through how we can improve the security of the process. And to me, that is so important because elections are a resource-starved area. And when I say resources, I don't just mean money, although yes, money is the case. I recently talked to an election official from Connecticut that lost out on a funding request for badging in and out of the office, so a simple security protocol, because the park needed to redo the gazebo. And that's very real choices at the local level that happen for election officials when you're competing with fire and police and rescue. And so elections need resources, but elections also need resources in the form of expertise and support. And that's what this handbook and some ongoing activities that the EAC has helped to coordinate between Harvard, the Center for Internet Security, even work from Google and Facebook, as well as the Department of Homeland Security. These are resources that have never been available to election officials before to really help them evaluate where they are in the security process, what steps they can take to improve, and really make good risk-based decisions. And that, I think, is the real impact of this handbook, is it allows an election official at the state level, like the secretary, or at the local level to make good risk-based decisions in a limited resourced environment. That this lays out high-level and medium-level threats and allows them to say, what are we already doing? What do we need to be doing? And then what can I take to my county commissioners and say, look, we would be doing this, except we don't have the money or we don't have the expertise available to us. What can you do to help us solve this problem? And so the 88 technical controls that exist in here are incredibly helpful as someone that's worked as a CIO to be able to have the conversation with the technical folks, but then to translate it to the non-technical so that I could go to the policymakers and make my case for why this is important. That's why a document like this and collaboration with experts like this is so important. And so thank you for the time, and I'll cede my time over to Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you. What they said. Well, one of the things about being from New York is that people often tell me that I talk extremely fast, which is probably good because that's probably why they put me last, so that I can get all the things in the amount of time that we have. I will probably try to not echo too much what some of my fellow panelists said, although there are some things that we're doing in New York that are very similar. Just to kind of go back to what has been said about security always being an issue in elections. I mean, normally we think about physical security, and you mentioned storms. Obviously in New York we had Sandy, Irene, Lee, which affected elections. We were doing elections by flashlight in down in New York City, moving poll sites constantly, updating the voters as to where they should go to vote. So we're used to these kind of new challenges, and we're always trying to figure out how to adapt. I mean, I can tell you, any kind of election day, there's usually at least one fire alarm pulled. So, I mean, you always have to figure out how, what is the contingency for those kind of things. So cybersecurity is just one more of those things that we have to plan for as election officials. Obviously, with regard to what we do in elections, there are a couple different components that Mike mentioned that are in the book. Obviously, the voting systems. In New York, our voting systems aren't connected to the internet. They are paper-based, so we always have a record that we can go back to if there's any kind of question about the results. We do use the EAC's certification guidelines. In fact, we actually go further. Every time they say should, we make it a shall. So we make ours a little bit more rigorous. And we do a post-election audit just to make sure that the machines work the way they're supposed to. With regard to a little bit more technology, obviously the other big thing that gets talked about with regard to cybersecurity and elections is the voter registration rolls. For the most part, you have two different models of systems. You have a top-down system where the state provides or hosts the platform upon which all the local officials enter in their information, and then you have a system like that, the one in New York, which is a bottom-up system. So New York has 62 counties, and we have 58 boards of elections because the city board oversees the 5 boroughs. So there are 58 separate systems that we at the state board have absolutely no control over that all have to kind of get aggregated into our one single statewide system because under HAVA there's a statewide list that's required. So one of the biggest challenges that we have, or that many other bottom-up states probably have, is that you have this disparity in resources at the local level. I mean, we have boards that have probably hundreds of staff members and a dedicated IT system, and then we also have another board in New York that probably has, four employees, 2 part-time, and they're probably reliant on a guy who comes every other, week from a neighboring county. So that really presents a difficulty for us at the state level, trying to figure out how do we ensure that elections are not only administered uniformly across the state, but are also protected uniformly across the state. One of the other issues that we have because of the different elections infrastructures that are set across the state is we don't have any kind of commonality or standardized baseline to work from. So that's one of the difficulties that we have as well. And often I will say that the majority of county boards deal with county IT staff who are tasked with supporting all different agencies, not just the Board of Elections. So, usually the Board of Elections is the redheaded stepchild of county agencies. So we're trying to figure out how do we get them to the front of the line, or how do we improve the relationships between the IT professionals they rely on. There's also the challenge, obviously, with dealing with local election officials. I mean, Matt used to be a CIO. I have a lot of technology in my past, so but there was quite a disparity in tech savviness when it comes to county or local officials, and so we figure out how do we improve their education, how do we make them better informed so that they're better positioned to secure the elections on their own local jurisdiction. So just to kind of touch upon a couple things that we're doing in New York, we did undertake a statewide assessment where we went out to all the county boards and we surveyed them on some basic cybersecurity practices, anything from backup to physical security to handling of USB drives, firewall, virus protection, things like that. And so we were trying to figure out what's being done already, what's being done well, what may not be doing well, what do we need to do better? So then we can use that as a starting point to figure out what is our plan going forward. So we put together a multi-million-dollar plan. This year, we're still in the middle of our budget season. The governor did put $5 million in his budget towards that plan. We'll see how that all pans out. Hopefully it'll come through. So we hit the ground running with the things that we want to do to help secure not only the statewide system, but also help the locals with those resources as best we can. We also do, we do a lot of training every chance we get. Whenever we have county conferences where we bring in all the locals, I'm usually the one giving presentations on cybersecurity. This past year, in January, we had Matt and Ryan from the EAC come down and do a presentation that they do all around the country about election officials as IT managers, which really kind of, I thought went over very well. We also invited DHS and FBI to come in and kind of talk about cybersecurity and what's being done on that front. Obviously, we're also working with some of these partners. Like as I said, we work with DHS and the FBI and the EAC, and we're working with state agencies. Similar to Indiana, our governor also created a cybersecurity advisory board. We've been working with them since 2016 to try to figure out how to best kind of coordinate the different state agencies. We're currently working with DHS to try to develop some tabletop exercises that we can kind of facilitate across the state, just to kind of give county and locals a little more consumable way of understanding a little bit more about cybersecurity preparedness and response. We're also obviously working with other organizations to help standardize. Like I said, we have kind of a lack of standardization that we need to work from. CIS has been one of those partners. So we've been, I was very happy and thankful to be invited to work on the handbook. One of the things that I really like about the handbook that has been echoed by some of the other panelists, it addresses the challenges that I mentioned before, where you have that kind of varying degree of savviness and information. There's also often the disconnect between election policy people and IT people. You just don't speak the same In my past, I often had to be that bridge between the different people just to kind of explain what one was saying to the other. So I think the handbook actually goes towards doing so, and does so in a really helpful way, because I think in educating both the local election officials as to certain basic cybersecurity technology concepts, but also educating the local IT folks about what elections people are actually doing and why it's important to secure these systems, it really helps kind of build that bridge, kind of cross that divide, and really just kind of help educate them and help them to engage more. So with that being said, I know we're short on time, but I want to thank everyone again, and I want to thank CIS for inviting me to collaborate.
Tom, thank you. We're under the wire thus far. So let me open the floor to questions, and what I will do is I will pass the microphone, since we're recording this, to anyone who has a question so that you can make sure. No, Barb has a, okay.
You don't have to fill down.
Yeah.
I want to give you the opportunity. I thought you had a question.
I don't, but I want to compliment everyone, especially the center. I think this is a fabulous thing that they put together. Mike, you did a great job, and as analysts have said, it's going to be a huge asset to the elections community. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Anyone else?
Yeah, while we're getting ready for the next question, and before we got started, Ms. Lamone had mentioned that Maryland has already taken the handbook and done an independent their own assessment, so to speak, and she said she was quite pleased that Maryland results showed that they were doing the vast majority of the best practices, except for a couple that didn't apply. And I asked her, I said, well, how does that make you feel? She said, I feel heartened that a product developed by somebody independent, and my team tells me we're always doing a great job, and now I have a way of sort of independently validating, and it speaks well to the leadership within Maryland and the technical competence of the team. So, question?
Yes, my name is Charles Field. I have two questions. First, there's a wonderful presentation, and I'm encouraged by what you're doing. To what extent are the other states doing what you're doing? Are they way behind? And your encouragement for them to come up to where you are, or are they doing fairly well and you're nudging them to do better? The second question is, to what extent is the White House interested in what you're doing?
I'll take the first one, and I'll defer on the second one. All of the states across the board are working really hard on cybersecurity, and as I mentioned, like what Linda saw in Maryland, all of them, as they're going through the playbook or the handbook and looking at the best practices, they're doing many of them, and then there are some where there's room for improvement. And they're bringing that down to their locals also, because it's not just, are we doing this at the state level? It's, are we doing this at sort of every point of entry? This is an evolving area for election officials, as it is for, I think, most fields who are dealing with cybersecurity. And there's always things to learn, especially as things change, but far and away, election officials are all taking this incredibly seriously and recognize the important role that they play in making sure that our democracy continues to function as it should.
And on behalf of the National Association of Secretaries of State, I would just echo what Amy said. I don't know of a state that isn't taking it as seriously as they possibly can. Some have more support from their General Assembly and their governor than others, but I can tell you that the Secretaries of State are taking it seriously.
Yeah, and I just echo that. A lot of what I do is travel out to the states and meet with state and local officials. So the locals that are, the 8,000 to 10,000 local election officials that run elections, and the seriousness with which they're taking this, and the real hunger for information and resources has been everywhere. I have not gone anywhere where this isn't the topic of conversation at the election conferences with the county officials, trainings, information sharing, and resource sharing. And so I think the community as a whole has responded and met the challenge in front of them, certainly.
So I won't attempt to speak for the White House.
Oh, go ahead.
But since Bob Kowalski, who's the acting Deputy Undersecretary DHS for protection programs, what he would say, I think, in answer to your question is, there is no higher priority within DHS now than trying to improve security of elections. I know that as we support DHS, and we have access to the senior officials within the department. They are resourcing the activities, and they are committed to continuing to support the state and local folks. With regard to the White House, I think, again, I won't speak for them, but I think the sanctions that were announced today and tied to the elections activity, I think, are an indication that I think the U.S. government across the board treats this very, very seriously. Other questions?
Hi, Nancy Gallagher. I'm the director of the Center for International Security Studies here at Maryland. And I'm interested, I think this is a really useful project, and it's focused on sort of how do you reduce various types of technical vulnerabilities. If you were to say to national, state, and local level officials, different kinds of organizations, different types of responsibilities, what the single biggest cybersecurity risk is you think they face, and that would be some combination of technical vulnerability, an actor who'd be able to exploit that for some reason, and really serious consequences. Right? What is it you think they should be most worried about?
Well, I think if you asked each of us, you might get slightly different views. So quickly, what I would say, and again, my background is mostly technical. So emphasizing technical, what we found was the most significant vulnerability was the potential of disrupting network-connected components. That's why you've heard reference to voter registration, which is generally network-connected, which will not impact the vote, but will potentially undermine confidence and trust in the election system. And so I think what we, and working with the state and local folks, have realized is that even though we've done a pretty good job of protecting the elements of the voting infrastructure that actually capture the vote tally, and we have auditing procedures, there are elements that could potentially reduce the trust and confidence in the overall voting system, and that's those network-connected systems, and that's where we're focusing.
Just to build off of that, I completely agree. I actually think it's the disinformation. Nothing has to have happened for someone to claim it happened, and all of us up here, particularly those that run elections, have to be prepared to respond to that, whether something happened or not, right? And so the level of preparation that state and local officials are putting in now, not just on the technical side, but on the communication side, to be able to talk about their systems, to educate on how the process works, to talk about the redundancy and resilience of the process, that if something did happen to a voter registration database, there are hundreds of procedural controls that they've put in place to respond and recover from that, to combat just that misinformation effort. And it, just not to go on my soapbox for a minute, this is why elections are run locally, so that you can go engage your state and local election official directly about the process and participate. Not just as a, voting, please go vote, but go be a poll worker. Help secure the process yourself. Go watch pre-election testing. Go watch post-election audits or counts in your jurisdiction, because that's why we run it locally, so that you can engage directly with that process and get the information you need to have confidence that your vote counts.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on to what Matt said. I mean, again, I was going to actually say information or disinformation. One of the things that we dealt with a lot, especially when this was all kind of first starting off in our involvement with DHS, and there was a lot of news interest in this, is terminology. I know the EAC did put together a glossary about cybersecurity terms, because I can't tell you the number of times I was driving in my car and someone was like, 21 states were hacked. I'm like, no, they were not hacked. I mean, our systems get scanned every single day. Every system gets scanned every single day. But, so that's just, we know that happens, and we try to address it, and we have things in place for it. So I think that it's been very frustrating for me as an election official to sometimes hear words used interchangeably when they really should. And I think that that, like Matt was saying, that kind of misinformation can really just cast doubt where none really belongs.
Okay, I think we've run out of time. So thank you, the audience, for your attention and interest, and thanks to the panel for a very stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.